As the infected homunculus rises once more, all the pair can do is stare in horror once they hear the unmistakable click from their weapons. No ammunition left, no grenades, not even as much as a pointy stick. First Lieutenant Pierce collapses to his knees as he mentally prepares to deny the enemy control of his flesh. His companion growls. Was it disappointment? Pierce wonders, but could not say. He would rather go out on his own terms than becoming a meat puppet for the Flood. First Lieutenant Brandon Pierce was convinced he had to be the most idiotic man alive. He had managed to survive the entire Human Covenant war, both on the front lines and in his infiltration assignments. Now that the war was over, he felt justified with retiring. He never needed the money. He was a Pierce. He only joined the war effort to do his part, or at least that's what he told himself. He knew that wasn't it though. Deep down inside, he was an infant. The right set of shiny dangling keys could make him do anything, and the possibility to see alien technology up close and personal had been what really drew him in to join the Navy. His desire to be first in line to get his hands on those purple toys. He pushed himself to become an ODST. Training had been hell, but he found himself enjoying it once he got used to taxing his body to hell and back. He loved the admiration of his fellow soldiers, but that admiration quickly died down as Spartans began to claim the glory for each battle. He didn't resent them for that. There was plenty of rumors about how Spartans were psychos who attacked ODSTs on sight, but he knew those were all made up. None of the details ever stayed consistent. He did resent them for an entirely different reason, however. He could count in one hand the number of people he believed could possibly take him on in his prime. His hand-to-hand combat skills had been nothing to scoff at. His shooting was superb. His stamina was at the peak of human capacity, and his ability to make quick and life-saving decisions was unmatched. Why had he not been chosen to become a Spartan? This was the question that lingered in his mind for decades. After the war, when Oni approached him to train future Spartans, he felt insulted. He was good enough to teach them but not be one of them? He yelled at the Oni spook. The man said nothing and walked away. Pierce didn't know if that made him more angry or not. Not having an explanation had bothered him so much. He had been one of Oni's best hitmen during the late years of the war. He was pushing 40 and was still one of Oni's top operatives, only behind a Spartan and Locke, a man 25 years younger than himself. Pierce had not heard from the UNSC or Oni for almost a year, when he was surprised to find that same man visiting him at his family's resort on Luna. This time, the man came seeking him with an agenda. He needed something from Pierce. He knew he could use this as leverage to get the answers that weighed on his mind, but the Oni spook had been prepared. He felt like he had walked into a trap. He had agreed to go on a mission for them if they could tell him why he was never chosen to become a Spartan. The man handed him a file and told Pierce he had been. The man walked away saying something along the lines of, "Be ready tomorrow morning at 0600. Soon after, a Pelican took off and flew into the distance. Brandon Pierce did not understand what the man had meant. He had been chosen to become a Spartan, but never went through with it. The enclosed file had a simple message written over it. Opening this file is acknowledgement to partake in mission designated Convex. He didn't care how dangerous the mission might be. All he needed was answers. He quickly opened the file to see several reports that shocked him to his core. When he was 6 years old, a group of men had tried to kidnap him. Pierce still remembered the memory as a triumphant time in his life. This had made him feel strong, confident, and special since he was a young man. He had managed to wrestle himself out of the grasp of the men by kicking one between the legs and biting the other one until flesh came off between his teeth. He ran away and alerted his family. The men were gone by the time security came looking for them, but from that point on, he was never alone again. His family had assumed the kidnappers were after some ransom money. The Pierce family was well known, with luxury homes in half of the colonies. He had never imagined this was his mischance. He caught himself. Mischance? No, they were kidnapping kids. The most inhuman thing he had seen after working for Oni for 2 decades. He had been sent on missions to assassinate insurgents in front of their families, and even he thought this was too much. But still, those who were successfully taken were to become the best of the best, unrivaled in every aspect. He wished he had never learned this information. His mind was wrestling with his humanity. On the one hand, he finally felt like he was good enough. On the other, he felt an obligation to expose this information and have the galaxy convict these child-abducting monsters. But he knew Oni better than that. If he didn't join their mission in the morning, he would not make it off Luna. When Section 3 of Oni handpicks you for a mission, saying no isn't a choice. Everyone told him retirement didn't suit him, but he quite liked not being part of the secrecy and bureaucracy anymore. He should have gone with his gut instinct. He'd been a fool to accept the mission. He had now found himself on board an unmarked and most likely unsanctioned frigate on the outer edges of the solar system, preparing for a slipspace jump. Only after getting them out here in the middle of nowhere were they given more specifics. He knew he would be seeing Forerunner technology, which was the first reason he had remotely considered the mission. Why else would ONI have approached him, and not someone younger? Once ready to be put into cryo before the slipspace jump, he was introduced to half the crew, all ODSTs. This made him wonder where the rest of the squad would be. Sure, 4 ODSTs were a good start, but they would seemingly be dropped into new territory to investigate the potential of hostiles. Since the war had ended, he hadn't heard of any hostile activity aside from the insurrection in the colonies and Sol's Orc Cloud, so he wondered if the hingeheads or monkeys were back at it again. He thought it best to leave it alone, until they reached their targeted site at least. What weighed on his mind now was who the rest of the squad would be. Something told him he wouldn't like the answer, and he was right. Pierce had just awoken from cryo after 9 days of instant sleep. No sooner than him getting dressed did Adkins rush to him to say,
"Don't freak out, they're friendly."
Pierce was more alarmed by whatever that statement meant than by what was behind the door outside Cryo Bay 2. The moment the doors opened, he instinctively went for his sidearm, but found nothing there. The elites approaching did not have their weapons drawn, but made a quick gesture. One would have missed it if they had blinked, but they had the same reaction upon seeing the human reach for a weapon that wasn't there. 4 elites came through the doorway, one of them massive enough that he had to duck down. Even Spartans didn't usually have to duck to getting through these doorways. There he went again, thinking about Spartans. When he wore the ODST armor, that thought was always on his mind. Even now that he knew the truth, he couldn't help but think of what if. He pushed those thoughts away immediately as the general in charge walked in.
"Would you care to follow me? Excuse the secrecy, but the nature of the mission required it. For those of you wondering why there are Sangheili here, it's very simple. You will be landing on a Forerunner installation and exploring it. You will be the first point of contact, and HighCom believed a joint operation with our Sangheili allies was warranted as a show of trust. The Arbiter seemed to agree and sent 4 of his best operatives. I suppose we are due for introductions."
Pierce did not listen to any of the names. He didn't care for the elites. He had spent over 2 decades trying to stay alive on the opposite side of a barrel from them. He was absolutely repulsed by everything they were, from their looks to smell and everything in between. He found those 4 jaws creepy and unsanitary, their claw-like fingers untrustworthy, incapable of a proper handshake. Their horizontal eyelids and vertical slits reminded him of a snake in the Garden of Eden. Sooner or later, they would betray humanity. He could feel it. He didn't care if they had a truce and helped them win the war. As far as he was concerned, he had buried way too many friends because of them. After introductions, there wasn't much time for small talk, which really was fine by him, but this meant he didn't get a chance to coordinate with the rest of the ODSTs either. He had heard their names before. These were ONI ODSTs after all. Before being put into cryo, he'd gotten the chance to read their files. Furthermore, he had operated in the same theater of war as some of them. In the case of Sergeant Cole, the marksman of the team, he had been deployed as part of the same squad or company a handful of times before. A skinny man in his middle age, who preferred to wear glasses over having laser eye surgery, like the rest of the ODSTs. His greatest claim to fame was beating a Spartan in target practice once. What the file didn't mention was that the Spartan in question was June A266, Oksana Michalovicha, one of the biggest women in the UNSC. He'd storm a beach on the second moon of Gamaxi with her company in 2549, and even Pierce couldn't help but be impressed. She often went into battle with a machine gun turret. Pierce couldn't understand how she could fit it in a drop pod, along with her bulging muscularity. Lastly, there was one he wasn't very familiar with, a very young and recent addition to ONI's roster, Cecilia Adkins. He didn't know what to make of her, but he believed she was troubled by some sort of dual identity disorder. Sometimes she was reserved and quiet, but other times she was playful and talkative. He had just seen her out of cryo and her entire personality had flipped like a light switch. What little he knew of her was how her parents had been buried alive in the rubble of a downed apartment building in Sidonius 5. After several days of them starving, she was bone thin and managed to fit through the debris. She went out looking for help and ran across an elite and 2 jackals. When Lieutenant Commander Ronson and his forces found her, she was repeatedly stabbing a shard of broken glass into an elite's eye, with both jackal's entrails covering her body. The Covenant had dug her parents out, only to execute them in front of her. How a 60-pound girl had managed to take down and kill a fully grown elite through 2 weeks of starvation and dehydration was beyond comprehension. But Pierce was just glad to have her on his side. He was still uneasy seeing this ragtag group of individuals. He couldn't understand why nor how ONI had chosen the personnel for this operation. He thought maybe it came down to one simple reason: secrecy. Pierce knew they wouldn't breathe a word of what they found. just the way Oni liked it. He had been number 3 until the death of the Spartan Grim Reaper, after which he was widely considered as number 2, and some even thought of him as the best operative at Oni's disposal. But these guys? They were closer to 10, 11, and 12 by all standards. Had he really been relegated to the lower league after less than a year of retirement? Maybe that was the problem itself, retiring. Section 3 still wanted to control him, even after all the hard work he had put in during the Battle of Reach and Earth. Realizing maybe it was time for him to start slowing down now that he was in his 40s, he dropped his hesitation. If they didn't send the A-team and were sending these guys, the situation was bound to be a walk in the park. After loading up with a silenced SMG and a dual pair of pistols on his sides, Pierce watched as the rest of the ODSTs prepared their weapons. The armory had brought an arsenal, which seemed strange at first. A lot of firepower for an exploration and possible first contact mission. He didn't think much of it considering there were elites on the roster for this mission. He chalked it up to the captain wanting to impress the elites. Not only with the caliber of weapons, but also the fact half the armory was filled with plasma weapons. He was never a fan of using those, but he knew his way around one in a pinch. He had been the only one to stick with human weapons alone. Atkins took a shotgun and a plasma repeater. Cole took a beam rifle, some plasma grenades and an assault rifle. Michelovich had sported a pair of needlers and a Spartan laser on her back. Pierce wanted to say something about it considering their full gear on included respirators and several dozen pounds of protective plating, but she seemed tough enough to carry it all around. Not the choice he would make, seeing as this was akin to a recon mission, but he'd seen her carry a machine gun turret through wet sand an entire day with very little rest. He noticed each one of the elites was traveling light, with a sword and a carbine rifle. One single elite had taken the offer for human weapons, the big one that had ducked through the doorway. He hoisted up a rocket launcher on his shoulder like it was nothing. He clearly intended to walk around with it no matter how much it weighed. He wondered if this was the elite trying to show off for a moment, but by simply looking at him, he could tell the elite was plenty strong to carry around and not feel its nigh unbearable weight. Once they all made their way into the vehicle bay, he received quite a surprise. They weren't dropping in from orbit. That was fine by him. He didn't want another reason to wake up with his bones rattling the next morning. But why send ODSTs in this mission if that wasn't on the table? They had plenty of Marines who could undertake this mission. Was it solely for secrecy? A battalion of Marines would be able to accomplish more than 4 ODSTs and 4 elites could, and it would certainly be cheaper in terms of asset deployment. That being said, it would be a lot harder to cover up if they found something. Everything in this mission was upside down. What should make sense didn't. And what should be red flags made him only more intrigued to get on with the task ahead. They loaded up into a Pelican and Phantom respectively. Brandon Pierce had offered to fly the Pelican, but was glad to have Cole volunteer loudly. He hadn't flown a Pelican since the fall of Reach, and that had ended up in a crash and a blazing ball of fire. Once the vehicle bay hatch opened up, and they had started making their way down to the surface, he realized what a huge mistake he was making joining this mission. The briefing had said this was a Forerunner installation, not one of the installations. Pierce had assumed it was the Dyson Sphere Trevelyan, and they had found another world inside the supermassive solar system-sized sphere. Or perhaps a brand new shield world as they had called them. But this was far, far worse. They were heading down to a Halo ring. Ground zero for the galaxy-wiping powers that would be. He'd read about everything the Master Chief went through on the first and the second ring. But there were key spots covered in black ink. Even with his level of clearance, he never got a chance to read those parts. All he knew about the hidden and blacked out sections on the files was that Oni had recommended a psych eval for the Master Chief. He wanted no part of that. Whatever Oni thought would scare the Master Chief was more terrifying in his own imagination. His instincts were to turn around and abort the mission, but he couldn't bring himself to say so. The awe of witnessing such a magnificent place up close had taken hold of him. The Pelican and Phantom landed atop a mountain range. They had received the dumb AI as their guide through the installation. All information they had was based on the other Halo rings, and they wanted to compare and contrast the infrastructure and architecture. When they landed, they found a distinct lack of sounds. He had expected to hear the whirling of machinery, maybe some birds, but there was nothing. It was like being in space. No sounds besides their own footsteps. He knew the Forerunners were efficient. Even after 100,000 years, their machines didn't gather dust, but he wondered if the monitor of this installation himself had even been here for a millennia. The place seemed absolutely dead. As the team began to descend the mountain, they came across some ruins. Ruins really wasn't the right word. It was all kept in pristine condition, no matter how ancient it was. The buildings all seemed to have similar design but different purposes. Pierce couldn't begin to comprehend what they were, even with AI G4736T guiding them. It was instructed with not providing any more than necessary information, and it definitely showed. Questions about what other structures and buildings housed, or what they might be used for, were not answered. Instead, it would lead them where it wanted. No, where it was programmed to go. The AI was too simple and rudimentary for him to be upset at. More importantly, the elites had some rudimentary knowledge of Forerunner language and thus knew more or less where they were headed within the installation. He decided that although a leader had not been chosen amongst neither the humans nor aliens, he would be okay to follow them about. Pierce was used to working alone and he did not take orders very well in the field, but he knew it was smarter to follow someone who knew their way around, instead of wandering around at your own wit. As far as the ODSTs in this mission went, he outranked them all, but the AI had been given to Cole. They had spent the better part of an hour trekking through the ring, building after building. They had found no signs of activity, no sentinels, no monitor, no life. That was wrong too. There was life, the most simple and mundane of all, grass. After coming down the mountain range and crossing the rocky terrain, he had seen enough grass to know at least something was alive, even if it was only plant organisms.
Watch your step, humans!
One of the elites growled as they led through the edgy rocky terrain. They had only chosen this route as it led directly to the building the AI had pointed out. A slightly different, yet unmistakably important facility. Crossing the footfall jagged landmass was difficult enough, but in a hurry, he thought this would be a challenge. Pierce had been keeping track of their entire journey should he need to turn tail and run. It was just a habit he had picked up through years of solo hunting Covenant. When they made it inside the facility, he began to feel as if something was wrong, but he could not tell just what. He checked his equipment. He was at just under 80% breathable air for his equipment, and about the same as far as power went. This wasn't Mjolnir, but his visor, radar, and light still relied on that power to keep going. He turned off the light to conserve some energy, while allowing Cole to lead the human foray. He thought the elites must have had a built-in night vision mode into their helmets, as they had not so much as stumbled or misstep in the dark. Pierce almost jumped out of his skin when he heard the first sound that wasn't from them. It sounded like a slug had slimely crawled across a glossy surface. Everyone turned to look in all directions. The sound echoing from wall to wall meant they couldn't pin down where the sound had come from. G4736T encouraged them to keep moving, but with a mysterious noise, no one moved a muscle. The elites all stood ready with their swords, and the entire group held their breath momentarily, making 0 decibels worth of noise. The only sounds in the chamber now were speeding heartbeats. They all held position for what seemed like eternity, checking their motion trackers and every last one of their sensors. But nothing came. No one wanted to be the first to move, but they couldn't very well stand in the middle of a room for the rest of their lives. Pierce led by example instead and lowered his weapon. The elites turned off their swords and holstered them. With this, the atmosphere had once again calmed down, but he knew they were being watched. As they delved deeper into the facility, he found himself distracted, wondering what could have made that sound. Pierce had been on dozens upon dozens of worlds and not heard any animal like that. That really didn't surprise him though. The Forerunners had probably kept pets here from all corners of the galaxy, but something about the slugging sound made him uneasy. After finding himself lost in thought, he'd finally lost count on the 11th or 12th turn. So many lefts and so many rights that it all became difficult to even think about. On their final turn, they saw a long, straight corridor leading to a singular door. Once they all approached the door, one of the elites said it was best if they left the door be. But the ODSTs were not content with doing so. Michalovic had suggested blowing a hole through the door with her Spartan laser, but none of them were too keen on possibly damaging whatever was inside. After some arguing about the Cole Protocol and how it didn't apply anymore, considering the war was over, and everyone in the galaxy knew Earth's location, the group decided to plug in the AI and have it open the path. A dumb AI was smart enough to at least brute force your way into places, but this lock was of Forerunner nature. The task would take a while. In the meantime, Pierce had begun looking around. A smell of sweat, blood, and decay had begun to permeate the area. But he couldn't explain where that smell was coming from. As he walked down the hallway back the way they'd come from, he noticed a tiny shimmer. Something he had missed on his first walkthrough. It had been following right in the middle of the group, and the shimmer of one of the plasma weapons must have drowned out the reflection peering at him from below. Once he reached the shiny object, he recognized what it was immediately. A nameplate. Typically for officers, these were held on the chest, and Admiralty carried them on their collars often enough. But regular soldiers, such as Marines, didn't have them. ODSTs did, but these were only issued as part of the uniform officially. Only a rookie would wear something so reflective. It was like painting a target on yourself, telling the enemy where you were. Pierce ducked down to pick it up, and as he got closer, he began to make out the tiny lettering. Private Dave Manarius. Brandon Pierce instantly knew something was wrong. There was the obvious and the more hidden. Firstly, the blotched drop of dry browning blood on the plate. Something had caused combat of some sort, but the clues were too minimal to know what happened. Second, the plate was clearly new and of human design, but the third thought worried him the most. Where was this private, and why had there been a private here before him? As far as he was aware, they were the first boots on the ground. It wasn't surprising to him that Oni would lie about this, but not giving them a warning was a different story altogether. Pierce went into combat mode without a second thought. His respirator activated and helmet tinted. The heads-up display began showing tactical combat data all around. Everything looked fine except for one thing, his motion trackers. They were heavily congested, with radar markings from left to right and all around him. The device even claimed there was movement directly in front of him. He saw nothing out of the ordinary. He wanted to believe in faulty equipment. Lord knows he'd seen his fair share of that out in the field. But this felt different. It felt intentional. He placed the nameplate on his pocket and got up to head back to the group. He shouted out the name of the one standing directly in front of the door.
Cole, hold up!
He immediately regretted getting Cole's attention. Maybe if he hadn't made the sergeant turn and look away, he would have been fast enough to react. But Pierce would beat himself up over it for the rest of his life, no matter how short that may end up being. The moment Cole was distracted, his device carrying the dumb AI succeeded in opening the locked door. Pierce had found the private in question. When the door split ajar, a human-esque figure was standing there, waiting to pounce on its prey. The insignia on the side of the uniform was unmistakable. What was once Private Dave Manners was a hobbling creature whose face was melded into its left arm, a spike sticking out said arm in a stiff jettison position, while the left arm was now a claw shaped very much like a crab. The claw had positioned itself on Sergeant Cole's shoulder and held it with a grip so strong, Pierce could visibly see the skin's necrotic rot encroach up on the side of Cole's neck. Brandon Pierce blinked rapidly 3 times to understand what was happening. In the span of that time, shots began to ring out from several plasma weapons, and a familiar chime of projectile needles ringing through the air had jumped him back to his senses. From the door, several dozen creatures emerged, some minuscule, ranging from a half-foot tall to others being over 6 feet tall and humanly shaped. The 6 remaining members of his squad all leaped back while blasting everything in their arsenals. In a matter of a singular second, Cole was gone. His corpse was being dragged into the room, while several of the smaller forms clambered on top of it and tried to tear their way into his flesh. The next one to go down was the White Elite. Pierce had not noticed until now, but when the main door had opened, several more on the adjacent sides also split open. Tiny life forms emerged from every single one of them, except one. Pierce cursed his luck. One of the larger creatures walked through the door to his side. It wasn't quite fast enough to get the jump on him, but it was not slacking by any means. It was doing its best from the looks of it. The creature made its way through a rain of SMG shots Pierce had begun spraying into it. His brain had not computed the process of events. He had been shooting for a solid 3 seconds as his magazine ran out entirely before the creature had stopped. He instinctively reloaded, and only then did his mind have enough time to catch up to what was happening. The creatures he had fought back on Earth, before the cleansing of New Mombasa, they were back. No, they were here. They had never gone anywhere. Pierce saw them in his nightmares almost every single night. Things had only started getting better recently, but he had a feeling if he ever went to sleep again, it would be a miracle if these creatures didn't make a guest appearance in his dreams. After reloading, he turned to see the White Elite swinging his sword wildly. As an infection form clutched to his face vigorously, one sword on his left arm and a carbine on his right. The carbine was firing aimlessly, and while he was hitting enemy targets every direction he shot, that was not a matter of his aim being particularly exceptional. It was more of an indictment on their situation. They were surrounded on all sides. If there were less enemies around, Pierce would have been more concerned with a stray shot from the elite hitting him. He could see one of the red elites, the bigger one of the group, try to reach the white one now on the floor. Out of the corner of his eye, it looked like the tall one had executed the smaller white one, but he could not be sure as his focus drifted to the foes on the other side of his barrel. Pierce was making his way back to the core of the group, but the attempt itself was futile. The group had begun to scatter to avoid contact with the creatures, and soon enough, they would be too spread out to come together in this mess again. Pierce had finished reloading his 3rd magazine of SMG ammo into his suppressed weapon when Sergeant Cole emerged around the corner. It was sporting his face and armor, but clearly wasn't Cole anymore. The creature's arm had fused with the equipment it wore. The beam rifle was now more part of himself than it could ever have been in life. It swung the arm wildly, smacking the blue-tinted armor elite into the wall. Even through the gunfire and screaming, Pierce had heard the cracking of several bones. Several of the small forms jumped onto the blue elite's direction the moment he hit the wall, but they popped and evaporated upon making contact with his energy shields. The coal creature turned its gaze to Oksana Michalovica and fired a beam shot rifle right through her as she aimed the Spartan laser its way. Oksana's right bicep was burnt clean off. The force of the shot pushed her down and she stumbled backwards. She fell on her rear, launching a full blast from her Spartan laser through the coal creature and the ceiling above. He had to give it to Forerunner architecture. The damage had been minimal in comparison to what he had expected. The laser created a gaping hole onto the floor above them and dropped down rubble into the flood form. This had the opposite effect he wanted to see in the group. Instead of them coming together to fight as one, they spread out to avoid the falling debris. Michalovica cursed at the top of her lungs. Pierce tried to make his way to her when he saw the slim-bodied physique come to her rescue. Michalovica had dropped her laser and began stabbing at the wind to prevent any creature from jumping on top of her. Pierce couldn't focus on both the human females to his left and the broken elite to his right. He saw Atkins helping Michalovica and thought it best to help the elite. He had no love for the squid-faced aliens, but he knew the more bodies the flood gained, the more difficult the fight would be. He shot his SMG with his right arm down the hole to protect the blue elite as he gathered his strength, and his sidearm from the left leg to keep the smaller ones clear of himself. But he couldn't help as the situation worsened. The creatures were separating them, corralling them into different rooms, spreading them out as much as they could. He was being forced into a path on the right side of the main hall, while Atkins helped Michalovica up on her feet. The last things he thought when he saw them were that Oksana was tough. She'd lost a quarter of her arm mass, basically most of her bicep muscle, and she was still holding on to the needler on her right hand while shooting another from her left. The Spartan laser had stayed staged on the floor. It was clear the creatures did not want to move it, a simple prop to them. They refused to touch it, but not out of fear. The Spartan laser had a strategic purpose. It was a worm in the middle of the hallway, and they were the fish. Whoever took the bait would find themselves in the middle of more trouble than they could handle. Pierce was forced into his own hallway right as he saw a tendrilled hand take hold of Selena Atkins's leg and lift her vertically in a split second. Pierce wanted to save her, but he had no shot. He considered for a moment shooting her directly in the head and stop what fate was about to become of her. But he made the call not to. As he ran down the corridor, he wondered if he had been the most or least humane thing he'd ever done. With Michalovica right next to her, she still held a chance of survival, but as things were now, he could only guess what kind of creature could have lifted her up with all that gear on, with a single appendage. He didn't know how much combat Atkins had seen, but if Oksana was used to taking down brutes with her bare hands and a knife, he only hoped she would manage to help Atkins. The thought of his teammates were stopped by a faint shadow ahead. Pierce looked up within his heads-up display only to see how much ammunition he had left. 2 magazines and his almost emptied out clip. Whatever was up ahead, he would have to steady his aim for and take quick but deliberate shots. He saw another shadow rush by, but this time much quicker. Somehow, he had managed to see what the movement had been though. It had been the white elite, or at least the creature piloting that body. But what was it chasing? No sooner than he had asked himself did he hear roars down the hall. He followed them quickly, only to find the white elite infected atop the blue elite with the broken bones. The blue elite was struggling and loosing, his arms holding back the white flood forms in a pointless attempt as the creature had clearly gained an overwhelming strength. Pierce was shooting at the white elite, but it would not relent. He crushed one of the blue elite's wrists as his shields popped. With a scream of pain, the white elite went in for the kill, when the second red elite came out from around the corner. This was the smaller one, and although Pierce thought size didn't matter, part of him wanted the bigger elite to show up and lift the white one off the still living blue one. Another part of him was just glad the Sanghili hadn't shown up and blown them all up with the rocket launcher he had been carrying around. It didn't matter to Pierce though. He was just glad the red elite had shown up and sliced the white one into pieces while he ejected the empty magazine out of his weapon. He finished reloading it but holstered it. He took out both sidearms from his sides and approached the elites. As the blue one's shields began to recharge.
We need to regroup and get out of here.
Doc Smallbolt still lives. We must find him.
Atkins and Michalovica are alive as well, but on the other side.
The females surely have perished by now.
Pierce wasn't too sure about that statement. He planned to argue his point when the red elite interjected.
We must find them all and retreat to our vessel.
Pierce focused on the red elite. If things got worse, he thought he would rather stick with the red one over the blue. It wasn't a matter of injured or encumbered. It was simply his attitude towards the humans. It had not been the most damning of all. The three now proceeded to backtrack the way the red elite had come from, when more flooded creatures made their presence known. 6 combat forms and nearly 2 dozen smaller infection forms sprinted at them, with one carrier in the back. Pierce was far more confused about the infected in the back than the ones on the front. How had a jackal gotten here and gotten itself infected? As far as he was aware of the jackals, only a handful had sided with the elites after the separation of the Covenant, and jackals had no allegiance to humans either. Throughout the war, he witnessed some non-hostile Kigyar working with insurrectionists and stranded survivors on the outer burnt colonies. But he couldn't think of a single reason Oni would have worked with said pirates and schemers. They were too unpredictable and untrusty. Brandon found himself thinking too much again. Instead, he relegated all his energy to dual-wielding his pistols and popping the little creatures before they could reach the elites and himself. It was his best option, as he could leave the combat forms for the two elites. He managed to put every bullet to work, whether outright popping the wet balloon-like pus-spreading creatures, or injuring them enough for a swift kick out of existence. He maintained his calm while removing pieces off the board. The Red Elite had managed to take down 3 of the human combat infected with swift slices that left them tattered into distinct tiny cross-cut sections. The Blue Elite, though, had a lot of trouble with his non-dominant hand. He killed 2 of the flood creatures, but the last one gave him more trouble than he could handle. The Elite had broken down into a coughing fit. Pierce thought how difficult it had been for him to breathe when he broke his ribs, falling out, a burning pelican on reach, and he couldn't blame the Elite. Pierce was about to stow his pistols away and shoot the final one with his remaining SMG ammo, but it reached over for the Elite before Pierce could reach for his weapon. It was grabbing him, squeezing his leg like an empty can, crushing both bone and flesh. The Elite screamed, but sacrificing his leg to peel the sword through the infected flesh gave him the will to go on. Pierce quickly used his pistols to take out the legs of the hobbling creature now close enough to worry him. The creature fell, and as its body began to expand, a trace of blue flew past Pierce's view. The walls were suddenly illuminated a new shade of blue, and a blast of plasma heat radiated from where the hobbling creature had been. Pierce turned to look who had thrown the grenade, the Red Elite or the Blue one, but what he saw actually managed to surprise him. The Red Elite cutting off the head of the Blue one and shooting his carbine into the remains. Pierce steadily held out his weapon in the other's direction. He wondered if the Red Elite had gone mad with this pressure to survive, but he didn't see Craze in the golden glowing eyes.
This energy shield broke through earlier. The flood have infected the local atmosphere.
Pierce realized he had been wearing his environmental control gear, and it had been active from the moment he touched Private Manneris's nameplate. His instincts were still keeping him alive this old, but this did add another wrench to the equation. He had to monitor his air supply and pray his equipment stayed intact enough for it. Pierce had begun to formulate a plan when roaring and screaming began to be heard down the hallway. Panting and cursing could be heard, just as he was about to raise his voice and yell for the approaching to notice him. The Red Elite put his hand over the human's mouth. He made a tightening gesture with his 4 mandibles, shutting his mouth completely, and started running towards the wall within the hallway. They entered a hall into a tiny room, and the entryway began to close up once more. It seemed to Pierce as if this hall might fit a grunt just fine, but not a fully grown human man and an elite. He didn't entirely understand, but the logical part of his brain took over. He was about to give away their position, and as much as he was not a coward, he was also not dumb enough to not recognize a lost cause. Pierce watched in horror from inside the tiny room as Atkins ran past the entrance, followed momentarily by Oksana Michalovicha, and a horde of other infected creatures continued pursuing from behind. Tendrils struck out from her mouth, and boils of flesh popped all around her. A single needler shot was being shot with each step. Even after being infected, she was in there. Maybe just a bit, but her toughness had been carried out into the creature. The flood could make you someone else, but the core was still there. To that extent, he felt worse about what was happening. Him simply watching as the flood tank woman, alongside several more combat forms, chased down a petite woman down the corridor. He heard the pumping of a shotgun down the hall, and casing after casing hit the ground, until a click. He knew this click all too well. It was the sign no one wanted to admit. She had ran out of ammo. As he peeked through the small hole that was not yet done retreating, he witnessed shadows dancing a deadly choreography. He saw the small shadow the woman cast get tackled down. When he could no longer watch, he held his breath and listened, waiting for any screams, but none came. Just more roars and screeches. He didn't know if that was better or worse. He would have helped her, but just gotten them both killed. There was just too many of them. With what little ammunition he had remaining, he couldn't see himself making it out even with the elite's help. Pierce turned to look at the elite in his cramped quarters as he was checking the device on his wrist. Pierce recognized what it was. a cloaking unit. His thoughts ran cold and wild for a moment, assuming the elite would cloak and leave him to fend for himself. But he realized he was judging too quickly. The elite drained the power from his cloaking unit and channeled it into his energy sword. This calmed Pierce enough to at least know they would be in this for the long haul, however long they had left anyway. After the sound of roars and mushing flesh had passed, all he could think about was making a break for it. When he looked at his companion, it seemed as if both of them had the same idea, because the elite had gotten himself into a runner's pose, as he was preparing to take off sprinting through the labyrinth that was ahead.
We need to get out of here, but I'm all turned around.
I shall lead the way, human. I know the precise way to lead us out of here. We will encounter the parasite through this route, but we must get back to our vessels. We cannot allow them off this ring.
Pierce felt the sudden weight of shame bear down on him. He'd been too preoccupied with making it out of there alive himself that he'd forgotten to consider what would happen if the flood took their pelican and phantom and escaped off the ring. He'd been selfish again, and that just wouldn't do. If a single flood form escaped, it could bring down the entire galaxy. Everything humanity fought for and Master Chief's sacrifice would become meaningless. Pierce checked his oxygen supply once more. His HUD showed 21%. Nothing much he could do about the amount of oxygen he had left. He would just have to hope running out of here wouldn't drain it all. The pair finished checking their weapons and pushed the door in the wall wide open. They took off sprinting. While Pierce was going at full speed, he knew the elite was holding back to not separate from him. He regretted now not paying attention when the general was announcing their names. He'd showed them such little respect just because of his own prejudice against their entire race. He thought he was good at judging people, and he truly was. But that skill was much differently applied when it came to Xenos. As they ran through, Pierce began to realize how this entire level of the complex was just a giant honeycomb that always led down the same path. All roads ended on the big dual door they first opened to release this mayhem. That was helpful enough on its own, but he suspected the elite had already realized this and was using this knowledge to get back to the surface. He had only realized they were underground when Michelovic blasted through the ceiling only to see there was another level above them. When they entered, there seemed to only be one level to the whole place, but now he knew better than to go around wandering aimlessly in a Forerunner complex. They had made it into the main corridor when they ran into it, the hulking monstrosity that had lifted up Adkins with the ease of a child. Pierce was almost dumbstruck. He had nearly given up hope when he saw the thing before him. It'd seen brutes throughout the war, but this thing was twice the size. The Red Elite snarled once, launching himself toward the hulking beast, his sword glowing with a massive reflection of light. Brandon thought this must have been a result from the cloaking unit powering the energy sword and allowing it to overheat to temperatures it could truly damage the flood further. Pierce was expending all his ammo to keep the smaller ones off his companion when he realized they could not make it out with this thing chasing them and whatever was behind them. With his last clip of SMG ammo, he managed to push back the monstrous creature long enough to buy Red a break. He cursed himself internally. He was down to calling him Red. He had reduced the elites to simple characteristics such as color, like his ancestors were. If they made it out of here, he thought of redeploying to the Dyson Sphere and ending this xenophobic prejudice once and for all. With the small respite Pierce had bought him, the Red Elite put away his sword and began shooting the carbine rifle. It was leaving scorch marks on the creature but not stopping it. Pierce had ran completely dry except for his sidearms. He knew those wouldn't do anything to the colossal beast. That's when he spotted two things on the ground. The perfectly laid out bait that was the Spartan laser and the assault rifle on Sergeant Cole's back. Choosing which one to pick up was no choice at all. Pierce took the Spartan laser and charged it up, waiting for a clear shot from Red to move out of the way. The moment he did though, a heating beam pulsed through the air, striking the flood creature and launching it back down the hallway it had come from. A third of its mass was completely burnt off and the creature laid there without any movement. The pair both let out a sigh of relief until it caught in their throats and choked them. As the infected homunculus rises once more, all the pair can do is stare in horror. They hear the unmistakable click from their weapons. No ammunition left, no grenades, not even so much as a pointy stick. First Lieutenant Pierce collapses to his knees. He takes out his knife as he mentally prepares to deny the enemy control of his flesh. His companion growled. Was it disappointment? Pierce wondered, but could not say. Preparing for the unthinkable, he would rather go out on his own terms than becoming a meat puppet for the Flood. He had the sidearm still, but he had seen the Flood commandeer the flesh of those with bullet wounds to their head. He was planning to sever his spine and send his nervous system into shock, but he turned to look at the elite, breathing heavily and preparing his sword once more. Pierce knew if his companion hadn't given up, he couldn't either. He turned to look beside his knee and saw the Spartan laser had enough energy left for 2 more shots. but he knew charging up 2 would take too much time. He overrode the safety on the side panels of the laser, thought about how in another life he might have become a Spartan, and internally chuckled. This laser would have suited him well. As the massive creature approached him, it had to pass by the fallen debris from the ceiling. This is where Pierce would catch it. He waited to charge up the laser, knowing the more he waited, the worse the outcome would be for the weapon. It would certainly overheat, but the creature followed along as an actor reading from a script, and it clambered over the fallen rubble. Just then, Pierce began to charge up the laser. He planned to overheat it, use the energy of 2 blasts left in a single shot. He had remembered the charge time for a Spartan laser to be a grueling long 3 seconds. But this time, he felt as if it had taken less than a heartbeat for it to fire. Pierce was pushed back several feet. His gloves melted through and left his hands with third-degree burns. The pain on his palms was unbearable. He wanted to scream, but the kickback of the laser had slammed him into the ground so hard he had no air left in his lungs. He noticed he had begun to breathe in laboredly, heavy and exhaustingly. Pierce knew 1 or more of his ribs were broken, but had no time to think about it. The blast had not been meant for the creature. He had aimed right above it. He'd made a bigger hole in the ceiling, and with the fallen debris, the plan was to use it in order to reach the floor above. With his burnt hands, however, he had no illusions to be able to climb. He knew he could hold a pistol even if his hands were burnt and hurt to the bone, but resting his whole body's weight on the palms to climb was out of the question. But this was the moment his entire hatred for elites was erased. In the face of danger and adversity, the Red Elite quickly hoisted him over his shoulder, climbed over the rubble, and helped him reach the second floor without letting Pierce exert himself overtly. The Red Elite then leaped and caught himself on the higher level, climbed up and looked at Pierce. They exchanged a nod, a simple gesture that went a long way for any species. The elite looked around at his surroundings, and while Pierce still couldn't tell apart one Forerunner corridor from another, he could see in his companions' movements. He knew exactly where they were. The gamble he had taken on this elite, knowing where they were, had paid off. The 2 got up and managed through their pain as they ran through the building as fast as they could. Turning a few corridors, they could hear the horde of flood creatures in the distance. He knew they were being followed. Looking back would do him no good right now. After a final left turn, he saw the shimmering light of the night sky. The excitement in his body could not be contained. Pierce picked up his speed, now running faster than he had ever before. It wasn't long after that they had made it through the rickety, edgy path when they realized they had put a lot of distance between themselves and the facility. He knew the flood was still following, but he was halfway to the Pelican, and that's all that mattered to him now. Pierce took a look at his air supply and saw that only 2% oxygen was left. His worry had turned to fear, not knowing if he would make it back with enough air left. If he allowed his heart rate to track back down, maybe he could spare a few more breaths. But with the flood in pursuit, they had to keep moving. The Red Elite must have been able to tell what was on his mind as he forced him to slow down. His companion unholstered a weapon from his back and handed it to Pierce. Brandon didn't understand how he had been running behind the elite this whole time and hadn't noticed it. Sergeant Cole's assault rifle. Red had gotten it for him. He stopped himself from taking the weapon. Before this mission began, I had no interest in ever working with an elite. I owe you an apology. Thank you for saving my life. What may I call you? Before the elite could respond with his name, a stream of needles zoomed right past them both. The interruption forced Pierce to take the assault rifle without another word and unload on the creature. This had undoubtedly been Oksana. Parts of the uniform were still visible, but the flesh was so beyond unrecognizable, he second-guessed himself in regards to the first assumption. Pierce could barely hold the rifle between his scorched hands, but had to push through the pain, letting out round after round into the Oksana creature until it was brought down. He took a look at his ammunition to see just how low it was running, but that's when the Red Elite surprised him once more. He'd brought 2 more magazines from Cole's corpse. Though he now had more ammo, the situation did not look good. Pierce could see starlight shining off the moving corpses. The shambling dead creatures that were coming after them had caught up and surrounded them. All he could do was unload every bullet in his possession in their direction. Using his forearm and bicep to support the weight of the assault rifle off his hands, he blasted through. The pair was surrounded but slowly made their way uphill to the Pelican and Phantom. He had finally thought they may actually make it. He was almost happy until he saw the other Red Elite, the one taller than a Spartan. It approached him with a completely different stride in his step than previously, his body fighting itself with several jerky movements like tremblings under the skin. His red companion growled loudly. He did not know much about the Sangheili customs or expressions, but he could tell this growl was clearly one of pain, not the physical kind that can be ignored. This was much deeper. His companion dropped the empty carbine and took out his sword in an elegant swing, activating it at the same time. The elite simply said,
"Get to the ship, human. Make sure they do not leave this ring.
Pierce wanted to argue. Something along the lines of, "I won't leave you behind," came to his mind. But he knew that safety of the galaxy outweighed the bond he had formed with this elite, or any of his ODST brothers and sisters. He ran up the last part of the hill to the back of the Pelican, while hearing screaming roars from behind him. 2 feet away from the Pelican, he heard a noise he had been dreading, the sound of a rocket launcher blasting from its barrel. His instincts once more took over and he hit the deck. He felt his body weight smack against the floor, once and for all helping him determine just how many ribs he had broken. His weight bearing down on the ground helped him with one more thing though. It pushed his broken rib into his lung. He felt the puncture and collapse of his lung as blood began to flow in. The rocket flew right past above him, striking the Pelican and launching it forward several feet. The right engine was instantly in flames. Pierce struggled heavily to get back on his feet and considered still getting on the Pelican and firing up the engines, or at least climbing in the back for some ammunition and biofoam. His injuries were internal though, and biofoam could only do so much for his burned hands. Still, he decided to try, but once again the booming of a rocket launcher trailed through the cold night air. This time, he didn't even try to get down. He stood there, still, while the rocket flew right past him, a foot away, and struck the Pelican once more. The ensuing explosion completely took out the right wing and launched the Pelican off the hill, a 100-foot drop easily. Pierce turned to look the way the rockets had come from. The giant red elite was heading his way, with an energy sword stuck through his chest and an empty rocket launcher hefted on his shoulder. Pierce could no longer stand on his knees. As they were shaking, he could barely breathe, and his whole body felt heavy. He squatted down and landed on his rear. Clutching his burnt hands for a moment, he reached for the pistols on both his sides and started letting off shot after shot. The flooded elite just kept creeping on him, slowly and menacingly, as he crawled to the Phantom. As he reached the Phantom's loading platform, he felt the slick metal graze against his hand. He struggled to board while crawling as his grip continued to slide off. Pierce tried to use all his strength to get up again and reach the mounted plasma turret, but he simply could not. The flood form kept maliciously stalking him, step by step, as his right sidearm ran dry, click after click of no ammunition. He let go of it, focusing all his strength in steadying his shots from the remaining pistol. The elite's shields were still active, but glowing. Even until his final bullet, all he could do now was throw the pistol at it. He heaved it as hard as he possibly could, and with that final action, the elite's shields finally broke. It did not matter though. He could not reach over for the turret, and he certainly couldn't reach the weapons inside the Phantom. Just as Pierce had given up hope, he heard the grunts of a woman. A very distinct set of vocal cords came through gritted teeth. He looked up to see Atkins atop the elite's back as it struggled and tried to strike with his flailing arms. Atkins dodged both swings while holding on to the elite's neck. She unleashed a downward spiral of attacks with her combat knife, stabbed and prodded at the creature repeatedly and endlessly, cuts and jabs slicing essential tendons. The creature began to collapse under the weight of Atkins' knife. In one final struggle to attack the human on his back, the Flood Elite reached over for her. This time, it did not miss. He grabbed her and slammed her right onto the ground. She bounced off the grassy and rocky terrain a few feet away as it crumbled to the floor. Pierce looked at the creature with a blade sticking out from where the elite's brains had been. She started to rise to one knee, and Pierce made a small gesture as if he was going to help her out. A meaningless gesture since he didn't think he had the strength to keep going, but he tried nonetheless. Atkins simply raised her hand in a stop motion, caught her breath and stood up. She hobbled over to Pierce and lifted his arm over her shoulder, giving him a hand up. He saw her helmetless face and realized she wasn't turning Flood. Only then did he notice his air supply had run dry and his helmet had been cracked. He thought it must have happened when the Pelican exploded and a small piece of shrapnel flew past him. He was lucky not to have been killed by it, but at least he no longer had to worry about the spores in the air. His luck immediately felt inexistent as he heard the roars coming uphill. He turned to look, seeing several more flood forms coming their way. Pierce reached over for his knife as Atkins headed to the plasma turret. She tried firing it, but it did not warm up. It did not spin, and it did not fire. She spat some blood out, ready to die, trying to take as many of them with her as possible. The two took a step back to lean their backs against the Phantom itself. Atkins began to rummage through the compartments as she pulled out a singular plasma pistol. Pierce couldn't think of a single time he'd seen an elite holding a plasma pistol, so he figured this must have been one left behind from when the elites were part of the Covenant. Atkins had only found one, and he was not about to ask for it. He was in no shape to be holding a plasma-based weapon with his hands the way they were. Even holding his combat knife was excruciating at this point. They had survived too much. He would not give up until his final moment, however. His lung collapsed, hands burnt, broken ribs, no ammunition, and his teammate seemed as if she had gone through it as well as he had. He closed his eyes for a moment. The ground shook beneath him. Dirt and rocks were launched in all directions, including at him. He opened his eyes back up and saw something quite familiar. An orbital dropshock pod landed in front of them. He heard the hissing of decompression as the latch began to open. It suddenly popped off its hinges, launching forward into the flood creatures ahead, splattering several of them along its way. From inside the pod, the large figure came out shooting an M5 assault rifle, clearing targets left and right. The sleek and heavy armor was unrecognizable, but also very evident of what was in front of him. A Spartan, unlike any he had seen before. This one was smaller, much smaller than the ones he'd seen. The armor was not quite as protective, but it would allow for someone not quite as strong and augmented to pilot. In the next few seconds, 4 more pods dropped from the sky, landing around them. The hatches opened and more Spartans came through, eviscerating the flood in their path. While the new 4 to land went on their way downhill to clear out all remaining flood, the first one turned around and approached Pierce and Atkins. He noticed it now more than before. The Spartan was big, but something was off with all of them. They were half as massive as the rest of the Spartans he had seen. Spartan asked if they were infected. While not directly aiming at them, he never lowered his weapon. Pierce managed to mumble a no out of his lips before the sound of falcons and pelicans drowned out his breathing. Atkins shook her head and looked away from the Spartan. The Spartan holstered his weapon and flagged down the falcons with his helmet's lights. The rest of the Spartans were now coming back up the hill, seemingly having defeated all the flood creatures. One of them said they would have to run scans constantly for the next few months, but they were pretty sure they had gotten them all. The Spartan leader turned away from Pierce and Atkins and instructed back to his team orders. Several medics in biohazardous suits approached him while the Spartan slowly descended down the hill. He lost sight of them as a medic shone a tiny flashlight into his eye, asking him the dumbest question he'd ever heard. "Are you okay?" Pierce would later find out these were the Spartans ONI wanted him to train when they offered him a position on the Infinity at the end of the war. Regular people augmented to a limited degree to use Mjolnir, or at least a variant of Mjolnir. The Spartan program had grown an incredible amount in the past 11 months, since the war had ended. He turned down the offer to become a Spartan 4, though he saw it in the ONI spook's eyes. The offer was not sincere, it was out of obligation. ONI may not have wanted to get rid of him, but they certainly didn't want to give him more power than he currently had. They would be content with letting him retire to his state on the moon after this mission. Pierce would also find out even later on that Atkins had actually accepted to join the Spartan 4 program. He was not angry or upset with the Spartans anymore. There was no grudge to hold. He'd done his duty his whole life, and now it was Atkins' turn. Brandon Pierce sold his state on Luna on January 2554, as well as every one of his assets in order to purchase the largest slip space-worthy ship he could take to San Helios and find the keep of the Red Elite warrior who had saved his life, and change his mind about elites as a whole. He would go on to spend a fortune just to track down information on the Red Elite that saved his life. He did not want to ask ONI for the elite's file. He would not be indebted to them again.